Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the Canadian Celiac Association's webinar, Celiac Disease and Income Tax, Tips on How to Manage the Incremental Gluten-Free Medical Expense Calculation. I am Lynda, and I am the moderator of the Canadian Celiac Association's Facebook page, and your host and presenter for tonight. The Canadian Celiac Association, fondly known as the CCA, is a national voice for people adversely affected by gluten and a registered charity. We have 5 key priority areas: increasing access to safe gluten-free food through advocacy and education, improving diagnostic rates and management of the disease through educating the healthcare community, improving quality of life through research and science-based information, generating awareness for a greater understanding of the disease, and finally, strengthening the community through support and resources. Before we start, I would like to just review how the webinar works. All participants have been muted so that everyone can enjoy the session with minimal disruptions. If you have a question for myself, please type them in the Q&A box. We'll get to them at the end of the presentation. This session will be recorded, so if you'd like to review any of the material on today's session, please feel free to check it out in a few days. We will be sending everyone a copy of the PowerPoint slides, so watch your inbox in the coming days. I now like to introduce myself. I was diagnosed with celiac disease as a teenager in the early 80s, and I have seen a lot of developments in the celiac and gluten-free industry over the last 4 decades. Today, I volunteer with several organizations, including the local BC and national level of the CCA. I also volunteer with Skate Canada and the Vancouver International Airport as a green coat. I do prepare taxes as a volunteer, and I have done so for about 35 years for family, friends, and for the last couple of years through the Revenue Canada Volunteer Tax Program, CVITP, doing taxes for low income and people with disabilities. I have also presented on several income tax topics within my local community, especially introducing income tax to new immigrants. I am currently the moderator of both the CCA National and BC Facebook groups. So let's get started on the presentation. Canadian income tax, incremental gluten-free medical expense deduction for those with celiac disease. So what this presentation covers: the history of past gluten-free related deductions, the definition of the gluten-free income tax medical expense, and what you need to calculate this claim. What is an incremental cost, and are there any exceptions to the rule? What is considered gluten-free for the deduction? And the spreadsheet for calculating incremental costs. How you fill out and complete the incremental cost spreadsheet, and some hints to help you. Who should and should not claim gluten-free food expenses. And then some income tax information from Revenue Canada. And lastly, questions will be addressed. So, the history of gluten-free income tax deductions. Prior to 2001, there were no deductions available for any food-related conditions. In 2001, a loophole was found by some people, and they filled out the form T-2201, which is a disability tax certificate, and in the elimination category, they declared they had celiac disease and they took a long time in the washroom and shopping and making their food. And that, under the disability tax certificate, was an inordinate amount of time, which you need in order to obtain the disability classification. The Revenue Canada in 2003 came out and said that you do not qualify for the disability amount based on this additional amount of time that it takes you to do these tasks. So in 2004, the loophole was closed. So in 2004, the medical expense for the incremental cost of gluten-free food was introduced. The Canadian Celiac Association, in about 2007, after a couple of years of having people figure out the medical expense for incremental cost, contacted Canada Revenue Agency and said, might there be an easier way of doing this? Can we just instead have a set amount for a person diagnosed with celiac disease to claim, like $500, $1,000? Or if you want to continue this medical expense calculation, they will add up the number of bread or the number of pounds of flour or the number of boxes of cookies that they have purchased in a year. But can we set what the incremental expense is that they can then use to calculate, so they don't have to go do all these comparisons? And after some discussions, the Revenue Canada decided that no, they're going to continue to require people with celiac disease to have to fill out the incremental cost spreadsheet for their food calculation. So the one thing I want to point out at this point in time is currently celiac disease is the only medical condition where food can be deducted as a medical expense. So in some ways, we are being given a accommodation by the Revenue Canada agency for the cost of gluten-free food. The challenge is that not everyone can make use of it. More on that later. What is the definition for claiming gluten-free medical expenses? So people with celiac disease can claim the incremental costs associated with buying gluten-free products as a medical expense. This incremental cost is a difference in cost of the gluten-free product compared to the cost of a similar product that contains gluten. So you take the cost of the gluten-free product from the cost of the gluten product, and the difference is the incremental cost. So what do you need to do? You need to be diagnosed with celiac disease by an authorized medical practitioner. The Canada.ca website under taxes has a list of authorized medical practitioners. Family doctors and gastroenterologists are authorized medical practitioners. You need to obtain a note from the medical practitioner that diagnoses you on their letterhead or prescription pad indicating both the date of your diagnosis and you have celiac disease and require a gluten-free diet for life. You can only claim the food for a person with celiac disease from the date of diagnosis onwards. So if you're diagnosed in June 15th, 2019, if you had been experimenting with gluten-free food prior to that, you can only include receipts from June 15th, 2019 onwards if June 15th is your diagnosis date. So find all your grocery receipts for the medical expense range being claimed where your gluten-free items were purchased. For the gluten-free items purchased, you need to find similar gluten items. So this is a tip. You want to find as cheap as possible for your area and keep the evidence, flyer, online ad, picture of the item and their price, etc. And then you use the incremental cost calculation. So before we continue, just a little bit about terminology and technology. And first of all, a pencil, a pen, and a calculator, or with a piece of paper, or a computer spreadsheet, or anything in between you want to use, is how you can calculate this medical claim. I use Word spreadsheet in this presentation, but whether it's got a piece of paper with columns on it or it's a software program, how you do this calculation is up to you. So an incremental cost, what does this really mean? Well, the incremental cost is the difference in the gluten-free product compared to the cost of a similar non-gluten-free product. It is calculated by subtracting the cost of a non-gluten-free product from the average cost of the gluten-free products that you purchased in the year. What are some exceptions to this rule? There are two exceptions. The first one is xanthan and guar gum, which are used in baking. They do not have non-gluten-free comparisons. Gluten, as you know, is in wheat, where there is no gluten in rice flour, sorghum flour, tapioca starch. So when people bake, they sometimes add xanthan or guar gum to give it an elasticity. There is no comparison to give that elasticity in the non-gluten-free, in the gluten-free world. The second thing is additional charges on bills at restaurants for gluten-free food items that allow you to eat the meal, such as buns, bread, or pizza shells. For example, if you go to Subway, they charge you $1.50 to $2 for the gluten-free bun, and that is a separate charge on the bill. It's those separate charges that you can add to your spreadsheet and claim as the incremental costs. Those are true incremental costs with no comparison. So what is considered gluten-free? According to Revenue Canada, items claimed on your spreadsheet to qualify as gluten-free must be items purchased or ingredients purchased to make a gluten-free food, such as bread, that are made under Health Canada's regulations. They must be labeled gluten-free. Naturally gluten-free items or ingredients are not to be included in the claim unless number 2 applies. So rice, which is not labeled gluten-free these days because it is a single ingredient and is naturally gluten-free, cannot be included on your spreadsheet unless it says gluten-free on the bag or the box. So plain rice is not gluten-free, but rice that is flavored because it has more than one ingredient often will say gluten-free on the box, and that can be included. The ingredients to make gluten-free food must meet number 2. So the bag of rice flour at the Asian market does not generally qualify because it's not usually marked gluten-free. So this is a sample of the incremental cost calculation provided by Revenue Canada. So there's 6 columns on your spreadsheet. 1 for the item category, 1 for the number of items purchased, 1 for the cost of the non-gluten-free product, 1 for the average cost of the gluten-free product through the year, column 5, which is the incremental cost, which is the difference between column 4 and column 3, and then column 6, which is the column 5, which is the incremental cost, times the total number of items in that group purchased in a year. And then the sum of column 6, which is the total amount of the incremental cost of the gluten-free item, that's the grand total of all the item groups. The one category, which is the fourth line where it says dining out, that's the total of the additional amounts paid for your pizza crusts, your bread, etc., when you're dining out. It's not averaged. There is no comparable cost. That is just the total of all those incremental costs that you paid when you dined out and had to pay a separate fee or amount for gluten-free bread, buns, or pizzas. Now, this next page just goes over how to fill out the spreadsheet. So we're listing names of food groups down the left side in column 1. So I suggest you group like things together. So your breads together, your cookies of a similar package size together, your flours of a certain size together, like all Bob Red Mills. I tend to group together. And then you find the cost of a non-gluten-free item and you place that in column 3. And then you add up the total paid for each food group and divide it by the amount in column 2 and enter the average in column 4. And then you subtract the two columns and multiply it by column 2. And then you get column 6, which is your total incremental cost paid for the gluten-free food in that category. Now, note item 8, for amounts paid in restaurants, just total the extra amounts that you are being charged separately on the bill for buns, crusts, bread, and enter that total in column 3 and carry it forward to 4, 5, and 6. So some hints about filling out the spreadsheet. For the gluten-free items, as I said, group like items such as bread, cookies, and crackers. Keep your itemized restaurant receipts if you were charged for the additional items. Use an envelope to keep receipts for entry. I have 2 envelopes, one for receipts to be entered and the other envelope for receipts that I have entered. I do this very regularly. I actually do it monthly, but you can do it quarterly. It takes me between 10 and 15 minutes when I do it monthly. I just go down the grocery bill and put G's on the items that are gluten-free because not all grocery bills actually say gluten-free item, gluten-free item, gluten-free item. But I know after we've gone grocery shopping which items are labeled gluten-free. And I just annotate that on the bill. After I've done that, I enter them on my spreadsheet, which I'll show you in just a minute. And just enter the gluten-free item, the number of those items I purchased, and I enter in the name of the item, whether it be Glutino bread or Pamela's cookies or cold cuts, turkey, oven roasted turkey cold cuts, those types of things. Some hints for the non-gluten-free items, and that is flyers and websites are your best friends. So if you're using a flyer, clip out the item and write the date and the flyer name on the clip out, which is like 2 inches by 2 inches, and add it to an envelope. So this is your third envelope, and this is your non-gluten-free items comparing envelope. So then you can, when you have an item in there, let's say it's bread for $1.99, whole wheat bread from Safeway for $1.99. And then let's say 2 weeks from now, you get a flyer from Save on Foods and it says you can get white bread for $1.49. Well, then you pull out your Safeway $1.99 and throw it away and put in the cutout from Save on Foods for $1.49, because that becomes your new gluten non-gluten-free comparable price. So you also want to get the closest equivalent size to the grouped items so that you're calculating based on equal sizing. Or, for example, gluten-free cookies usually come in smaller packages than you can get for gluten cookies. I know on my spreadsheet, Peak Freens, I had a package of 600 grams and I divided it in half because most of the gluten-free cookies that I had were actually 300 grams. So you can also do price comparisons that way by taking the gluten price, dividing it by a certain denominator to get it down to the price, the comparable size price for the gluten-free item. Then the last tip on this page is go to the online store for any ingredients that you can't find in the flyers. So I fairly routinely go to Save on Foods online site and check for sale items. And if items are on sale, I put them in my cart, then I print out my cart, then I empty my cart, and then I've got a printout of items that are on sale that are gluten items that I then can annotate on the printout and enter them in my spreadsheet as comparable items. So here's an example of a restaurant receipt where I got a cranberry chicken salad sandwich and I paid $2 for the substitution of a gluten-free bun. So that's an example of a gluten-free incremental cost. So now let's look at a spreadsheet. So this is the top part of one of my spreadsheets. You'll see in column D, that is bread. Column E is the info for the bread item. And column F is the number of bread items. So 659 glutino, 1 bread. And farther down the column, $6.99 for the glutino and 1 bread. Then I've got some cold cuts, and they're measured based on 100 grams. And then I've got cookies in a container and the different types of cookies and how many containers worth of cookies I have. Single cookies, so I paid $1.90 for a wow cookie, a single wow cookie, and so on. Here I mentioned the Bob Red Mill. There's my baking mix, less than a pound. So here they are when I've paid for less than a pound baking mix. And if I go to my next page, you'll see the bottom half of the spreadsheet. So here's the total of all my breads. So $48 in bread. I'm comparing it to Save on Foods bread, which was $1.99. I got 8 breads in the year. So 8 times $1.99 is $15 compared to the $48 in bread that was gluten-free. So there in the blue is my comparison cost of, or my incremental cost of bread in the column D at cell 102. And then as we go across to the right, you can see cold cuts and cookies in a container. And then, so here's your single cookie. I compared it to English Bay cookies, which were 12 to a pack. So this is been divided down so that it's one cookie at 29 cents, because the wow cookie in this column was a single cookie. So I can't really compare it to 12 of them. I have to go the other direction. So it's 12. It was the price of the English made cookies divided by 12 equals 29 cents each. And in comparison to the $1.90 paid. And as you can see, this total incremental cost added up to $909.99. So all is good in calculating this, and you have to start at the beginning of the year in calculating this and saving your receipts, because you don't know in the year how many medical expenses that you're going to get. None of us can foresee the future. But by the time the end of the year comes along, some people cannot claim this medical expense. And that is for the first reason, which has 3 bullet points. The first one is this is a tax credit. You must have paid income tax to receive a refund. If you do not have taxable income, then you cannot claim tax credits. And if your tax credits exceed your income tax paid, then no more tax will be refunded to you. So that's the basic premise how our income tax system works. The second why people cannot claim this medical expense is you have to exceed the deductible, which is 3% of your net income, or in 2019 tax year, $2,352. So that's the maximum. So if you earn $50,000, 3% of your net income of $50,000 is $1,500. So if you're single and you earn $50,000, it's going to be $1,500. So for example, if I was single, my $900 spent in gluten-free food, if I didn't have any other medical expenses, I would not be able to claim this medical expense, because my deductible at earning $50,000 would be $1,500. If you eat mostly a natural diet and very few gluten-free labeled foods, the credit will be very small. You can claim the credit for only those in your family diagnosed with celiac disease. So we're very aware that a family might all be eating gluten-free so that one member of the family is safe in their own house. However, if that's a family of 4 that's all eating gluten-free for one person, only the cost for that one person can be claimed on taxes. And then the other reason why people often can't claim this medical expense, and as I previously mentioned, you don't have any other medical expenses to claim to get over the deductible. So I've got 2 more slides of income tax information, and that is, the first slide is you can still e-file, and it is highly recommended that you e-file, and that is because the CRA only sees your medical expense amount. So if you had 3 amounts making up your medical expense that you were claiming, like $1,000 for glasses, $1,000 for gluten-free, medical expense, and $1,000 for prescriptions, so that's $3,000. When your taxes are submitted, only $3,000 shows. It doesn't show the 3 different categories. So the CRA only sees the $3,000. You need to keep your receipts and the original doctor's note. No need to send it to the government unless you're asked to do so. You will receive a desk audit when the total of $5,000 of medical expenses are claimed. And if you receive that letter from Revenue Canada, about your medical expense deduction, this is what you need to do. You need to get your original doctor's note, which you should get as soon as you're diagnosed. You need to get all your receipts you used for your calculations, plus the comparison receipts, flyers, papers that you used to create the comparison amounts, the spreadsheet to calculate the gluten-free expense, and any other receipts for that medical expense category. And you need to copy them all and keep the copies for your records and send the originals into the government. Once the doctor's note with regards to your celiac disease diagnosis is on file at the CRA, you don't need another one from your doctor because the first one should still be on file at the CRA. Lastly, I have spoken to Revenue Canada as of January 3rd, 2020, and they continue to say these are when they are auditing someone what not to do in submitting a gluten-free medical expense claim. Do not estimate your costs, what you purchased, or a non-gluten cost comparison. Submit the costs if you are not diagnosed with celiac disease, or submit costs for non-celiacs in your family or for other people. And lastly, submit costs for running a business selling gluten-free products, such as a farmer's markets. In terms of a desk audit related to your medical expenses, they will review every receipt and deduct what they do not deem qualifies. And they have the ability to audit you back 7 years. So that's the end of this presentation. I wish to thank you for listening. If you have any further questions about the incremental expense calculation or anything to do with celiac disease and how to calculate the different categories, please call the Canadian Revenue Agency at 1-800-959-8281. Also, general inquiries and questions can be emailed to the CCA Client Support Desk at askthecca@celiac.ca. So I'm hoping this has been a helpful presentation for everyone. And I just wanted to remind you that those of you that signed up for the presentation will receive a copy of this slideshow. Before we get to questions, I just want to remind everyone that this webinar has been recorded, and if you look at the CCA YouTube channel for the recording to watch it again or to share, it will be available in about a week. We have a number of interesting videos also and webinars on our channel, including the State of Celiac event, which brought together North American experts to discuss the major issues facing celiac disease and gluten-free in Canada. For those of you new to the gluten-free diet and celiac disease, we have an upcoming free webinar on January 21st called Gluten-Free 101, Navigating the Gluten-Free Diet, with our CCA registered dietitian, Gary Bawa. Check out our website under events to register. That is celiac.ca. I also would be remiss not to mention that the CCA is a national charity. In order for us to continue offering education, advocacy, investments in research, client and peer support, we rely heavily on donations. If you have enjoyed tonight's presentation and would like to donate, please visit www.celiac.ca and click on the Donate button. You will receive a link to an evaluation to let us know how we did tonight. We hope you complete to help us improve and to also offer suggestions on topics you'd like to hear more about from the CCA. Now on to our questions.